Any system that is designed needs to be designed, implemented, and most importantly, we need to measure the success of that system. And that's an element that's often forgotten. We sometimes put the system in place and we walk away, but we don't always go back and measure the success of that system. And in doing so, we need to ask ourselves two important questions. Can the design achieve the outcomes that we had hoped for? And secondly, is the design achieving the outcomes we had hoped for? What are the practical issues affecting the outcomes from people within that system? And in terms of system here, we're talking about employee benefits. And to illustrate this principle, we're going to take a retirement fund. We're going to take a large retirement fund in the municipal sector or in the public sector and consider the design elements of that fund in looking at question one. And second, in the second instance, we're going to consider whether in fact members are achieving decent outcomes from their retirement fund. So let's consider the first question. Can the design achieve the desired outcomes? If we look at this fund, it has a contribution rate of 23%. That means people are putting away 23% of their pensionable salary every month into this fund, between themselves and the employer. The retirement age is 63. So if we take somebody who's starting at the age of 23 and will save in this fund for 40 years, we would expect them, based on our modeling, to retire with a replacement ratio of around 94%. But the question is that the true picture? And so we delve a little deeper, and this is why measuring success is so important. When we consider that pensionable salary is only 60% of somebody's actual earnings, they're not really contributing 23% of their full pay. They're contributing 23% of 60%. And you can see where the problem arises. And in fact, the expected replacement ratio, based on their full earnings, is only 57%. And if you tell somebody that they're going to get half of their income as a pension, they're not as happy as when you told them they were going to get 94% of their pensionable salary. The second question is, are the design elements, or is the decent design rather, actually translating into decent outcomes? And when we consider that, we see that people are not retiring with anywhere near the 94% of their pensionable salary that the design is capable of delivering. And there are many reasons for that. The main reason for that is the much talked about preservation issue. In other words, people don't have 40-year savings periods. They change jobs, and when they change jobs, they access the cash within their retirement fund and don't actually save that or transfer that across to their new fund. And the upshot of that is when they retire, they're not retiring with 40 years service. They're only retiring with 10 or 15 or 20 years service, which simply isn't enough to provide a decent retirement outcome. So if we delve down a little further, what are the other levers that we can pull to try and amend things or try and improve the outcomes that the individuals are receiving? And to do so, we actually need to consider the whole fund. Just looking at the design for a new entrant age 23, that's fine for the design element, because that's actually what we're trying to achieve. That's the utopian solution. The new member starting at 23 who retires at 63, and we have them for 40 years in the fund, and we can actually manage their retirement outcome. But what about all the other members? They have different histories. Some joined last month, some joined 10 years ago. We need to consider all of those individuals. And in doing so, we consider all the members of the fund, and we can plot their expected replacement ratios against their ages, for example, or against their salaries, or against any other metric that you would like to see or like to use. And we generally use the age. And what it gives you is a very interesting spread, showing quite clearly that some members are on track for a decent retirement outcome, and others, unfortunately in the majority, are on track for an iffy or even poor retirement outcome. And we can actually see what the impact of changing any of the levers that I've mentioned earlier, what the impact of that would be, not just on the expected replacement ratio for that new 23-year-old who's joining us, but also for every other member, even the member who's going to retire in a year's time or in 2 years' time. So let's consider all the different scenarios. We've calculated a number of scenarios, and these will flash on the screen, and we'll talk you through them. So let's take the first one. In this particular fund, the costs, so the administrative costs, plus also the costs of the risk benefits, which is the death benefit and the disability benefit and so forth, is 4% of pensionable salary. What would happen if that 4% actually reduced to 3%? And we see that the expected replacement ratio would move up from the 57% that I mentioned earlier to 61%. In other words, it makes an approximate 3% or 3 percentage points difference in your expected replacement ratio. And that's great. So people can expect to retire with slightly more. The difference is not enormous, but there is a difference. And that difference would be the same whether we increase the overall contribution rate or decrease the costs, because each of those is exactly the same. It impacts on how much money is actually saved every month. One of the other aspects that we could change within the retirement fund design is to increase the retirement age. If we increase the retirement age from the current 63 to 66, the expected replacement ratio jumps from 57% to 66% on a total cost basis. And that's a nice improvement. The second thing we could do is actually not keep the savings period at 40 years, but actually start at age 23 and retire at age 66. In other words, increase the savings period to 43 years, and the replacement ratio then jumps to a healthy 74% of a person's total earnings, which many people would consider adequate. The target, much quoted target, rightly or wrongly, has often been 75% of one's earnings. The last thing that we could do is to amend what we could get from the investment strategy of the fund. Could we squeeze our investment managers for some extra return? Could we change our strategy to deliver some extra return? Are we too conservatively invested? Are we paying too much for our investment managers? If we could reduce the investment charges, or alternatively eke out an extra 0.5% either way, the expected replacement ratio would also improve from 57 to 64%. In other words, 0.5% change on our assets under management on an annual basis has a bigger effect than the 1% contribution rate change or costs and risk benefits change that I mentioned earlier. We've seen how changes to different elements of the system and different inputs into the system could affect the retirement outcomes of the individuals in the fund we've chosen to use as an example. But it really was just an example. The most important point is that it makes no sense for trustees or an employer to implement a system or implement a fund or implement a medical scheme and simply walk away thereafter on the basis that it's implemented and everything should be okay. You need to measure the outcomes that the design could deliver, and those outcomes change over time, not because of what members are doing, but because of what's happening in the world. And secondly, you need to measure what outcomes people are actually achieving, and in this instance, it may be because of what members are doing. And then thirdly, consider which of those elements you could change to actually improve the outcomes that individuals could achieve from the system. And really, that's what we're after. We want to design a decent system, we want to implement a decent system, and then we want to monitor whether individuals are achieving what it is that they would like to achieve from that system.